18-year-old Robert Bever and his 16-year-old brother Michael Bever stood before District Judge Sharon Holmes in the Tulsa County Courthouse on August 9, 2018, both wearing orange prison jumpsuits and ankle shackles, their expressions blank and emotionless as the judge prepared to sentence them for one of the most horrific family murders in Oklahoma history. The brutal stabbing and hacking deaths of their parents, David Bever, age 52, and April Bever, age 44, along with their 3 younger siblings, 12-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Christopher, and 5-year-old Victoria, in a massacre that occurred on the night of July 22, 2015, in their suburban Broken Arrow home, where the brothers had methodically attacked each family member with knives, hatchets, and a tomahawk in a killing spree that left 5 people dead and 2 severely wounded sisters who survived only by hiding and playing dead. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For 3 years between the murders in July 2015 and Michael's trial and sentencing in 2018, investigators, prosecutors, and the shocked Broken Arrow community had tried to understand how 2 teenage brothers from what appeared to be a normal, intact family could commit such unspeakable violence against their own parents and siblings, murdering 5 family members, including 3 young children, in a premeditated attack that Robert had documented extensively in journals describing his desire to become a famous serial killer and his plan to murder his entire family as practice, before he and Michael would embark on a cross-country killing spree, targeting random victims at truck stops, rest areas, and restaurants across America. The journals, recovered from Robert's room after the murders and later entered as evidence at trial, contained detailed planning about how they would kill their family members, what weapons they would use, how they would dispose of the bodies, and fantasies about the notoriety they would achieve as the most prolific serial killers in American history. What made the case particularly disturbing wasn't just the brutality of the murders or the young ages of the victims, but the cold, calculated nature of the brothers' planning and their complete lack of remorse afterward. In recorded phone calls from jail that were played at Michael's trial, the brothers could be heard laughing and joking about the murders, with Robert at one point telling Michael, "We almost got them all. If Crystal and Victoria hadn't run, we would have had a perfect score." In another call, when Michael expressed concern about the length of his potential prison sentence, Robert responded, "Dude, we're going to be famous. We'll have books written about us. Girls will write us letters. This is what we wanted." These recordings, which shocked the jury and gallery, demonstrated that even years after brutally murdering their family, the Bever brothers felt no genuine remorse for the lives they had taken, only disappointment that they hadn't been able to complete their plan and frustration that they had been caught before they could kill again. District Attorney Steve Kunzweiler, who prosecuted both brothers and described the Bever family massacre as the most horrific homicide I have ever prosecuted in his 40-year legal career, had sought the death penalty for Robert, but settled for a plea deal when Robert agreed to testify against Michael and accept a sentence of life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving multiple decades. For Michael, who was 16 at the time of the murders and therefore ineligible for the death penalty under Supreme Court precedent barring execution of juvenile offenders, prosecutors sought the harshest possible alternative: multiple consecutive life sentences that would ensure Michael would never leave prison, would die behind bars decades from now, having spent his entire adult life incarcerated for the murders he committed as a teenager, who chose to follow his psychopathic older brother on a quest for fame and infamy that destroyed an entire family and devastated a community. When Judge Sharon Holmes pronounced sentence on August 9, 2018, 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each family member Michael had helped murder. The courtroom erupted in emotional reactions. Family members of the victims wept with relief that justice had been served, and that Michael would never be free to hurt anyone else. Michael himself showed no visible reaction, simply staring straight ahead, as if the sentence didn't apply to him or didn't matter. And Robert, who had already been sentenced to life with parole possibility after 40 years, watched from the gallery where he had been brought to witness his younger brother's sentencing. His expression impossible to read, but witnesses later describing him as appearing almost satisfied, as if the multiple life sentences proved the significance and notoriety of what they had done. The brothers who had joked about murdering their parents and siblings, who had planned to become the most famous serial killers in America, had indeed each received life sentences, but not the kind of fame they had imagined. Robert Austin Bever was born on November 17, 1996, in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, to David Bever and April Bever, a couple who met and married in the early 1990s and quickly started building a large family. David worked in technology, holding various positions with telecommunications and IT companies, earning a solid middle-class income that allowed the family to live comfortably in Broken Arrow, a suburb of Tulsa known for good schools, low crime, and family-friendly neighborhoods. April was a stay-at-home mother who dedicated herself entirely to raising the children and homeschooling them according to the family's conservative Christian values. The Bever family would eventually include 7 children total. Robert, born 1996, Michael, born 1998, Daniel, born 2002, Christopher, born 2008, Victoria, born 2009, Crystal, born 2001, and Autumn, born 2013. David and April raised their children in a highly controlled, isolated environment. The children were homeschooled from an early age, had limited contact with peers outside the family, were not allowed to have friends visit the house, and were subject to strict rules about internet access, television, music, and other media. The family attended a conservative Christian church, but were not heavily involved in church social activities, preferring to keep to themselves. From the outside, the Bever family appeared to be a large, intact, religiously devout family, living a quiet life in suburban Oklahoma. Neighbors occasionally saw the children playing in the yard or noticed the family coming and going, but the Bevers kept to themselves and were not particularly social with neighbors. Those who did interact with family members described David and April as strict but not obviously abusive, and the children as quiet, polite, but somewhat odd, socially awkward in ways that suggested they had limited experience interacting with people outside their immediate family. But inside the Bever home, dynamics were developing that would ultimately lead to catastrophic violence. Robert, the oldest child, was highly intelligent, but emotionally disturbed in ways that were not recognized or addressed by his parents. As Robert entered adolescence, he developed an intense fascination with violence, death, and serial killers. He spent hours researching infamous murderers, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Columbine shooters, the Aurora theater shooter, reading about their crimes in exhaustive detail, watching documentaries and news coverage, and beginning to fantasize about committing similar violence himself. Robert's isolation and lack of normal peer relationships exacerbated his developing psychopathy. With no friends outside his family, no school environment where concerning behaviors might be noticed by teachers or counselors, and parents who either didn't recognize or didn't know how to address the warning signs Robert was displaying. His violent fantasies intensified without intervention. By the time Robert was 15 or 16, he had progressed from passively consuming content about serial killers to actively planning to become one himself. Michael Bever, born November 5, 1998, was 2 years younger than Robert, and Hero worshipped his older brother. In the isolated Beaver household where the children had limited relationships outside the family, Robert and Michael formed an intense bond characterized by Robert's dominance and Michael's submissiveness. Robert shared his violent fantasies with Michael, showing him videos and articles about serial killers, discussing what it would be like to kill someone, and gradually drawing Michael into his plans. The dynamic between Robert and Michael was crucial to understanding how the murders eventually occurred. Robert was the planner, the dominant personality, the one who conceived of the idea to murder their family and become serial killers. Michael was the follower, the younger brother desperate for Robert's approval and validation, willing to go along with increasingly disturbing plans because he worshipped Robert and wanted to be part of something that made them special and important. As Robert's plans became more concrete, Michael didn't question them or resist. Instead, he enthusiastically embraced them, excited to be included in what Robert framed as their destiny to become famous. In his journals, recovered after the murders, Robert wrote extensively about his motivations and plans. One entry from early 2015, months before the murders, read, "I have decided that my family must be eliminated. They are holding me back from my true purpose, which is to become the most prolific serial killer in American history." Michael understands. He sees what I see. Together, we will start with our family and then move across the country, killing randomly. We will be legendary. People will study us for years trying to understand why we did it, but they never will because they're not like us. Another entry detailed the specific plan. We will attack at night when everyone is home and contained in their rooms. We'll start with the parents so they can't interfere. Then we'll go room by room taking out the others. We have to be thorough. No survivors except maybe Crystal and Autumn, who we might take with us. After the family is dead, we'll take the van, whatever money we can find, and weapons, and we'll head west. We'll kill at truck stops and rest areas, shooting random people and then moving on before police can respond. We'll be like the DC snipers, but better, smarter, harder to catch. These journal entries would later prove crucial in establishing premeditation and the brothers' state of mind. This wasn't impulsive violence born of abuse or sudden rage. This was calculated, planned, fantasized about for months, with detailed logistics worked out in advance. The brothers wanted to murder their family, and they wanted to become famous serial killers. That was their goal, their shared dream, the thing that excited them and gave them a sense of purpose. David and April Bever were, by most accounts, strict parents, but not overtly abusive in ways that would explain their son's violence. David worked long hours in IT and was often tired and disengaged when home. April managed the household and homeschooling with firm control, implementing strict rules about behavior, chores, and the limited freedoms the children were allowed. But former friends and extended family members who knew the Bevers would later tell investigators they had never witnessed physical abuse, severe punishment, or anything that would suggest the parents deserved to be murdered. The most likely explanation, supported by forensic psychologists who later evaluated Robert, was that Robert suffered from antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic traits. A constellation of personality characteristics, including lack of empathy, grandiosity, manipulativeness, and callous disregard for others. This wasn't caused by his parents or his upbringing, but was likely a combination of genetic factors and early developmental issues that manifested as Robert matured into adolescence. The strict, isolated homeschool environment may have prevented early detection and intervention, but it didn't create Robert's psychopathy. It simply provided an environment where it could develop unnoticed until it manifested in catastrophic violence. Michael's participation, in contrast, appeared to be more about susceptibility to Robert's influence, hero worship of his older brother, and a desire to be part of something that made him feel important and special. Michael didn't show the same level of psychopathic traits as Robert, but he was willing to commit horrific violence when Robert framed it as their destiny and their path to fame. By summer 2015, the brothers' planning had reached a critical point. Robert was 18 and Michael was 16, old enough to execute their plan, but young enough that they still lived at home and had access to their intended victims. Robert had acquired weapons, several large knives, a hatchet, and a tomahawk that he had purchased or obtained without his parents' knowledge. He and Michael had discussed the plan extensively, role-playing different scenarios, discussing which family members would be easiest and hardest to kill, and building themselves up psychologically to actually carry out the murders. On July 22, 2015, a Wednesday evening, the stage was set for the massacre. All 7 children were home, as were both parents. It was a normal summer evening. The children had completed their homeschool work for the day. Dinner had been eaten, and family members were in various parts of the house engaged in evening activities before bedtime. David was in the master bedroom. April was in the common areas of the house. The younger children, Daniel age 12, Christopher age 7, Victoria age 5, and Autumn age 2, were in their bedrooms or playing in common areas. Crystal, age 13, was in the room she shared with her sisters. Robert and Michael were in their shared bedroom, preparing mentally for what they were about to do. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, the brothers spent time in their room that evening psyching themselves up, discussing one final time how they would proceed, and retrieving the weapons they had hidden: multiple large knives, the hatchet, and the tomahawk. They changed into dark clothing that wouldn't show blood as readily, and at approximately 11:30 p.m., they began their attack. The brothers started with their parents as planned. They entered the master bedroom where David was in bed, possibly already asleep or preparing for sleep. Robert struck first, attacking David with the knife, stabbing him multiple times before David fully comprehended what was happening. April, hearing the commotion and David's cries, tried to intervene to protect her husband. The brothers attacked her as well, stabbing and hacking at both parents with the knives and hatchet, in a frenzied assault that left David and April dead or dying in their bedroom. With their parents incapacitated, the brothers moved systematically through the house, attacking their siblings. They went to 12-year-old Daniel's room and attacked him in his bed, stabbing him multiple times. They moved to 7-year-old Christopher's room and killed him in the same manner. 5-year-old Victoria was attacked in the room she shared with Crystal and 2-year-old Autumn. Crystal, 13 years old at the time, heard the commotion and screaming throughout the house, and quickly understood something terrible was happening. When Robert and Michael entered the room she shared with her younger sisters, Crystal saw them attack Victoria, stabbing the 5-year-old repeatedly. Crystal tried to protect her baby sister Autumn, grabbing the toddler and attempting to flee. But the brothers attacked Crystal as well, stabbing her multiple times, Crystal collapsed, severely wounded but conscious, and had the presence of mind to play dead, lying motionless while the brothers stood over her, checking to see if she was still alive. 2-year-old Autumn, too young to understand what was happening, was crying loudly, and the brothers attempted to kill her as well, striking her with weapons. But Autumn's crying apparently unnerved them, or made them worry about drawing attention, and in the chaos of that moment, with Crystal playing dead and Autumn screaming, the brothers made a critical decision. They would flee the house immediately rather than ensuring all witnesses were dead. What happened next would save Crystal's and Autumn's lives. Crystal, severely wounded with multiple stab wounds but conscious and driven by desperate maternal instinct to protect her baby sister, waited until she heard Robert and Michael leave the room. Then, despite her injuries and blood loss, Crystal grabbed Autumn and managed to move to a different part of the house where she hid, holding Autumn and trying to keep the crying toddler quiet. Crystal knew she needed to call for help, but the brothers were still in the house, and she was terrified they would find her and finish what they had started. Meanwhile, Robert and Michael were gathering supplies they planned to take with them: the family van keys, cash, their weapons, some clothing and supplies. They had murdered 5 family members, both parents and 3 siblings, and critically wounded Crystal. Their plan was to load up the van and begin their cross-country killing spree. But as they were preparing to leave, making noise and moving things around, a neighbor named Sean Swally heard unusual sounds coming from the Bever house. It was nearly midnight on a Wednesday, and the noises of commotion and someone running back and forth between the house and the garage seemed odd and concerning. Swally walked over to the Beaver property to see if everything was okay. He didn't witness the murders directly, but he saw the brothers acting strangely, loading items into the van, moving quickly and purposefully. Something about their behavior and demeanor struck Swally as very wrong. The boys weren't supposed to be out this late, and they seemed nervous and agitated when they noticed Swally watching them. Swally couldn't have known in that moment what had just occurred inside the Beaver house, but his instincts told him something was seriously wrong, and he made the decision to call 911 to report suspicious activity. At approximately 11:32 p.m. on July 22, 2015, Sean Swally called 911 to report suspicious activity at the Bever residence. While he was on the phone with the dispatcher, something even more crucial happened. Crystal Bever, who had been hiding with baby Autumn and bleeding from multiple stab wounds, managed to reach a phone and call 911 herself. Her call came in at 11:33 p.m., and the dispatcher who answered heard Crystal's weak voice saying, "Help! My brothers are killing my family. They've killed my mum and dad. Please send help." The dispatcher kept Crystal on the line, while emergency responders were dispatched immediately to the Bever home. Officers from the Broken Arrow Police Department arrived at the scene within minutes, approaching the house with extreme caution given the information that multiple people had been killed and the suspects might still be inside. As officers approached, they could hear 2-year-old Autumn crying inside the house, a sound that was both heartbreaking and hopeful because it meant at least one child was still alive. Officers forced entry into the Bever home at approximately 11:40 p.m. and encountered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood was everywhere, on walls, floors, doors, bedding. In the master bedroom, officers found David and April Bever dead, their bodies showing numerous stab wounds and blunt force trauma. In Daniel's room, they found the 12-year-old boy dead in his bed, stabbed multiple times. In Christopher's room, 7-year-old Christopher was also deceased, another victim of the brutal attack. Officers found 5-year-old Victoria Bever in the room she had shared with her sisters, still alive but barely. She had been stabbed multiple times and was in critical condition, bleeding profusely. Officers immediately called for additional paramedics and began first aid to try to stabilize Victoria. They found Crystal Bever hiding with 2-year-old Autumn. Crystal had multiple stab wounds and was losing blood rapidly, but was conscious and able to communicate. Autumn was physically unharmed but traumatized, crying and covered in her siblings' blood. As paramedics worked frantically to save Crystal and Victoria, officers secured the scene and began searching for the suspects. The brothers were not in the house. They had fled sometime between when the 911 calls were placed and when officers arrived. A massive manhunt was immediately initiated, with officers from multiple agencies searching the neighborhood and surrounding areas for 2 armed and extremely dangerous suspects who had just committed mass murder. Robert and Michael Bever had fled the house on foot when they heard sirens approaching, abandoning their plan to take the van and drive away. They ran into a wooded area behind the neighborhood, trying to put distance between themselves and the crime scene, but they were being pursued by K9 units and officers who had a description of the suspects from Crystal's 911 call. The brothers were located at approximately 12:30 a.m. on July 23, 2015, about an hour after the initial 911 calls, hiding in a wooded area approximately a half-mile from their home. When officers surrounded them with weapons drawn and ordered them to show their hands and surrender, the brothers complied without resistance. They were taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported to the Broken Arrow Police Department for questioning. Both brothers were covered in their family's blood. Their clothing, hands, arms, and faces all showed visible blood evidence. They made no attempt to deny their involvement, and when officers asked if there were any other victims or anyone else who needed medical attention, Robert calmly stated that they had killed their parents and 3 siblings, and that 2 other siblings might still be alive in the house. Back at the Bever home, paramedics transported Crystal and Victoria to hospitals in critical condition. 2-year-old Autumn, physically unharmed but deeply traumatized, was also taken to a hospital for evaluation and would be placed in foster care. 5-year-old Victoria Bever died at St. Francis Hospital at approximately 1:30 a.m. on July 23, 2015, roughly 2 hours after being stabbed by her brothers. Her injuries had been too severe. She had lost too much blood, suffered too much organ damage. Doctors and nurses fought desperately to save her, but she died surrounded by medical staff, far from the family that had failed to protect her. Crystal Bever survived, but barely. She required multiple surgeries to repair damage from her stab wounds and had a long, painful recovery ahead of her, both physically and psychologically. The physical scars from the wounds would heal eventually, but the psychological trauma of watching her brothers murder her siblings, of being attacked herself, of hiding and protecting her baby sister while bleeding and terrified, those wounds would take years of therapy to even begin to address. The investigation into the Bever family massacre moved quickly. The crime scene was one of the most horrific that Broken Arrow police had ever processed. Blood evidence throughout the house, 5 deceased victims, clear evidence of a sustained brutal attack. Crime scene technicians spent hours documenting every aspect of the scene, collecting evidence, photographing the devastation. Detectives interviewed the brothers separately at the Broken Arrow Police Department. Both Robert and Michael waived their Miranda rights and agreed to speak with investigators, a decision their attorneys would later say was a mistake, but which the brothers made in apparent confidence that they could control the narrative and perhaps gain notoriety by openly discussing their crimes. Robert's interview, conducted by Detective John Smith and recorded on video that would later be played at trial, showed him to be calm, collected, and disturbingly proud of what he had done. When asked why he had killed his family, Robert explained his plan matter-of-factly. "I wanted to be a serial killer. I've been planning this for a long time. The family was the first step. After we killed them, we were going to take the van and drive across the country, killing random people at truck stops and rest areas. We wanted to be famous. We wanted to be legendary." When Detective Smith asked if Robert felt any remorse for killing his parents and siblings, Robert paused before answering, "I feel like I should feel bad. I know that's what people expect, but honestly, I don't. They were obstacles. They were in the way of what Michael and I were meant to do, so we eliminated them. I'm mostly just disappointed that we got caught before we could start the really important part of the plan." Michael's interview showed him to be less articulate than Robert, but equally lacking in remorse. When asked why he participated in murdering his family, Michael said, "Robert had this plan, and I wanted to be part of it. I wanted us to be famous together. I wanted to do something important, something people would remember." When asked if he understood that 5 people were dead because of what he and Robert had done, Michael nodded and said, "Yeah, I know. But that was the plan. That's what we were supposed to do." These interviews, combined with the forensic evidence, the journals Robert had kept detailing his planning and motivations, and the testimony of Crystal Bever, who had survived the attack, formed an overwhelming case against both brothers. They were each charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of assault and battery with intent to kill for the attack on Crystal, and other related charges. The legal proceedings that followed would take 3 years to fully resolve. Robert, who was 18 at the time of the murders, was charged as an adult and faced the possibility of the death penalty. Michael, who was 16, was also charged as an adult under Oklahoma law that allows juveniles age 13 and older to be tried as adults for serious felonies, but was ineligible for the death penalty due to Supreme Court precedent barring execution of offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. In October 2016, after more than a year of pre-trial proceedings, Robert Bever accepted a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault and battery, with intent to kill in exchange for prosecutors taking the death penalty off the table. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, meaning he would be eligible to apply for parole after serving multiple decades, likely 40 or more years given the severity of his crimes. As part of his plea deal, Robert agreed to testify against Michael at Michael's trial. This testimony would prove crucial and would also give the public a disturbing window into the brothers' relationship and their planning of the murders. Michael Bever's trial began in April 2018, nearly 3 years after the murders. Prosecutors presented their case systematically, forensic evidence placing Michael at the scene and showing he had participated in the attacks. Testimony from Crystal Bever, now 16 years old, describing the attack and identifying both brothers as the perpetrators. The journals and writings showing premeditation and planning. And crucially, Robert Bever's testimony describing how he and Michael had planned and executed the murders together. Robert's testimony was chilling. He described in detail how he had recruited Michael into his plan, how they had discussed and fantasized about becoming serial killers, how they had specifically planned to murder their family as practice before embarking on a cross-country killing spree. Robert testified that Michael had been an enthusiastic participant, not a reluctant follower, and that Michael had stabbed multiple family members and had shown excitement both during the planning phase and afterward, when they thought they would escape and continue killing. The defense strategy was to argue that Michael had been under Robert's influence and control, that he had been manipulated by his older psychopathic brother, and that he deserved a more lenient sentence based on his age and his susceptibility to Robert's domination. Defense attorneys presented expert testimony about adolescent brain development, about the influence that dominant personalities can have over submissive ones, about Michael's difficult upbringing in an isolated, controlling household. But the prosecution systematically countered each defense argument. They played portions of recorded phone calls from jail where Robert and Michael discussed the murders, calls in which Michael did not sound like a reluctant participant or a victim of manipulation, but rather like someone who was excited about what they had done and disappointed only that they had been caught. In one particularly damaging call, Michael was heard laughing as he and Robert discussed media coverage of the murders, with Michael saying, "Dude, we're everywhere. Everyone's talking about us. This is exactly what we wanted." The jury heard testimony from forensic psychologists who had evaluated Michael. While Michael didn't show the same level of psychopathic traits as Robert, he did show significant antisocial characteristics, including lack of empathy, poor impulse control, and an apparent absence of genuine remorse for the murders he had committed. One expert testified that while Michael might have been influenced by Robert initially, his enthusiastic participation and his lack of remorse afterward suggested he had fully embraced the plan and bore full responsibility for his actions. On May 9, 2018, after deliberating for several hours over 2 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. 5 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of David, April, Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria Bever, plus assault and battery with intent to kill for the attack on Crystal Bever. Michael Bever showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, simply staring straight ahead while his defense attorneys sat beside him with expressions of resignation. They had known the evidence against Michael was overwhelming, and that conviction was almost certain. The sentencing phase began immediately, with both sides presenting arguments about what sentence Michael should receive. Prosecutors argued for consecutive life sentences, 5 life sentences to be served one after another, rather than concurrently, ensuring Michael would never be eligible for parole and would die in prison. The defense argued for concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole after serving a lengthy minimum sentence, giving Michael at least some theoretical possibility of the eventual release if he could demonstrate rehabilitation over many decades. The victim impact statements during the sentencing phase were devastating. Crystal Bever, now 16 years old, and the oldest surviving child of David and April Bever, took the stand to deliver a statement that brought the courtroom to tears. Crystal, who had spent the past 3 years in foster care, undergoing therapy to process the trauma of watching her brothers murder her family and nearly killing her as well, spoke directly to Michael about the impact of what he had done. "You were my brother," Crystal said, her voice strong despite tears streaming down her face. "I trusted you, I loved you, and you stabbed me and tried to kill me. You killed our little brothers and sisters. Christopher was 7 years old. Victoria was 5. They were little kids who never hurt anyone, who looked up to you and Robert, who thought you were their big brothers who would protect them, and you murdered them. You stabbed them over and over while they screamed and begged you to stop. I heard their screams. I will hear those screams for the rest of my life." Crystal continued. You and Robert took everything from me. You took my parents. You took my siblings. You took my childhood, my sense of safety, my ability to trust people. I wake up every night with nightmares about that night. I see Victoria's face. I hear her crying. I feel the knives stabbing me. I relive hiding with Autumn and praying you wouldn't find us and kill us too. You destroyed my life. You destroyed Autumn's life. And for what? So you could be famous. So you could be serial killers. That's not a reason. That's evil. That's just pure evil. Crystal looked directly at Michael and said, I hope you spend the rest of your life in prison. I hope you never get out. I hope every single day you think about what you did and about the people you killed. You don't deserve freedom. You don't deserve a second chance. You deserve to die in prison for what you did to our family. Other family members, aunts, uncles, grandparents of the murdered victims also delivered statements describing the impact of the murders on the extended family, the trauma of losing 5 family members in a single night of horrific violence, the knowledge that 2 brothers had committed this evil against their own flesh and blood. Several family members expressed support for the death penalty and their frustration that Michael's age made that impossible, but stated that multiple consecutive life sentences ensuring Michael would never be free was the next best option. The defense presented no mitigating witnesses. There was no one willing to testify that Michael deserved leniency, no family members who wanted to advocate for a reduced sentence, no friends or supporters who believed Michael should have any hope of eventual release. Michael's defense attorneys made a brief argument that sentencing a 16-year-old to die in prison was disproportionate and violated principles of juvenile justice. But their arguments rang hollow given the brutality of Michael's crimes and his documented lack of remorse. On August 9, 2018, Judge Sharon Holmes delivered her sentencing decision. She began by noting that this was one of the most difficult sentencing decisions of her career, but that the evidence required a clear conclusion. Michael Bever, Judge Holmes said, you participated in the brutal murder of 5 members of your family, your parents, and 3 young siblings. The evidence showed that you were not simply following your brother's orders or acting under duress. You were an enthusiastic participant who helped plan these murders, who actively participated in killing your family members, and who showed no remorse afterward. You joked about the murders while in jail. You expressed disappointment that you were caught, rather than sorrow for the lives you took. You showed the court and this community that you are an extremely dangerous individual who lacks the basic human capacity for empathy and remorse. Judge Holmes continued, the law requires me to consider your age. You were 16 at the time of these murders. But the law also requires me to consider the nature and circumstances of your crimes, the need to protect society, and the likelihood of rehabilitation. After reviewing all the evidence, I find that you pose an ongoing severe danger to society, that you have shown no capacity for genuine rehabilitation, and that the protection of the community requires that you never be released from prison. Judge Holmes then pronounced sentence. It is therefore the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 life sentence for each of the 5 family members you murdered. These sentences will be served consecutively, one after another, not concurrently. Additionally, you are sentenced to an additional life sentence for the assault and battery with intent to kill Crystal Bever. These sentences ensure that you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will die in prison, Mr. Bever. That is what justice requires for what you did. Court is adjourned. As Judge Holmes finished pronouncing sentence, the courtroom erupted in emotional reactions. Crystal Bever and other family members wept with relief that Michael would never be free. Prosecutors nodded with satisfaction that justice had been served. Michael's defense attorneys showed resignation. They had known this outcome was likely given the evidence and Michael's complete lack of mitigating factors. Michael himself showed minimal reaction initially, simply staring straight ahead as he had throughout the proceedings. But as bailiffs moved to escort him from the courtroom to begin his life sentences, Michael turned and looked back at the gallery one final time. His eyes found Robert, his older brother, sitting in the gallery in shackles and prison uniform, having been brought from prison to witness Michael's sentencing. The two brothers looked at each other for a long moment, and witnesses later reported that something passed between them, a look of acknowledgement, perhaps of shared fate, the recognition that their plan to become famous serial killers had instead resulted in both of them spending the rest of their lives in prison, never to walk free again. As of December 2025, both Robert and Michael Bever remain incarcerated in the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. Robert, now 29 years old, is housed at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, a maximum security facility. He will not be eligible to even apply for parole until he has served at least 40 years, meaning he will be in his late 50s before he can be considered for release. And given the nature of his crimes and his documented lack of remorse, it is extremely unlikely he will ever be granted parole. Michael, now 27 years old, is housed at a different maximum security facility and is serving his 5 consecutive life sentences. Because his sentences are consecutive rather than concurrent, and because they were imposed without the possibility of parole, Michael will never be eligible for release. He will spend the rest of his life in prison, another 40, 50, or 60 years depending on how long he lives, and will die behind bars, having spent his entire adult life incarcerated for the murders he committed at age 16. The aftermath of the Bever family massacre devastated the Broken Arrow community and raised painful questions about warning signs that might have been missed. After the murders, investigators and psychologists who reviewed Robert's journals and the family dynamics identified numerous red flags that, in retrospect, suggested Robert was developing into a dangerous individual. But because the family was isolated, because the children were homeschooled without regular contact with teachers or counselors who might have noticed concerning behaviors, and because Robert was skilled at hiding his dark interests from his parents, these warning signs went unnoticed until it was too late. The case also sparked debate about homeschooling and the need for oversight to ensure children are not being isolated in ways that prevent detection of abuse or dangerous psychological conditions. Some advocates called for increased monitoring of homeschooled children, including mandatory periodic evaluations by mental health professionals or regular check-ins with social workers. Others argued that the Bever case was an outlier, that the vast majority of homeschooled children are well-adjusted, and that increased government intrusion into families' homeschooling choices would be inappropriate. Crystal Bever and Autumn Bever, the 2 survivors, were placed in foster care and later adopted. Crystal, who had provided crucial testimony at Michael's trial, has worked hard to rebuild her life despite the trauma she endured. She has spoken publicly on a few occasions about her experience, always emphasizing that she does not want to be defined by what her brothers did to her family, but rather wants to be known for how she survived and rebuilt. Autumn, who was too young to remember the attack in detail, is being raised by adoptive parents who are helping her process the trauma in age-appropriate ways. The Bever family home, the site of the massacre, was eventually demolished. The lot remained empty for years, a reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there, before eventually being sold and a new home built on the property by owners with no connection to the original tragedy. The case has been the subject of numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and news specials examining how two teenage brothers could commit such horrific violence against their own family. The journals Robert kept, the recordings of the brothers' jailhouse phone calls, and the testimony from their trials have provided extensive documentation of their motivations, planning, and lack of remorse. Psychologists and criminologists who study familicide and juvenile violence have analyzed the Bever case extensively, noting the rare combination of factors: a psychopathic older brother with grandiose violent fantasies, a younger brother susceptible to that influence and willing to participate, isolation that prevented intervention, and access to weapons and victims. The question of how Michael Bever, who did not display the same level of psychopathic traits as his brother Robert, could participate so willingly in murdering his family remains a subject of debate. Some experts argue that Michael was more influenced by Robert than he was willing to admit, that the hero worship dynamic made Michael susceptible to recruitment into Robert's violent fantasies. Others argue that Michael's enthusiastic participation and lack of remorse afterward suggest he shared Robert's violent desires and cannot be excused as merely a follower. What is clear from all the evidence is that both brothers bear full responsibility for the murders they committed. They planned the attack, they armed themselves, they methodically went through their home stabbing and hacking their family members to death. They showed no mercy when their victims begged for their lives. They felt no remorse afterward, only disappointment that they were caught before they could kill more people. They joked about the murders while in jail, expressed satisfaction with the media coverage of their crimes, and showed the world that they were exactly what the prosecution said they were: dangerous, remorseless killers who deserved to spend the rest of their lives in prison. The teen brothers who joked about murdering their parents and siblings, who planned to become famous serial killers, who believed they would be legendary. They each got life sentences instead. Robert will likely die in prison in his 60s or 70s, having spent 40 or 50 years behind bars. Michael will certainly die in prison, having received consecutive life sentences without parole that ensure he will never walk free. They are not famous in the way they imagined. They are not celebrated or admired. They are reviled, studied as examples of evil and dysfunction, remembered not as brilliant serial killers, but as two damaged teenagers who murdered their innocent family members in a senseless quest for notoriety. And 5 people are dead: David Bever, April Bever, Daniel Bever, Christopher Bever, and Victoria Bever. A family destroyed by 2 of its own members, parents and children who deserved to live, who should have been safe in their own home, whose lives were stolen by the very people who should have loved and protected them. That is the permanent, irreversible reality of the Bever family massacre. The brothers got their life sentences, the victims got death sentences, and the survivors, Crystal and Autumn, got a lifetime of trauma and loss that no amount of justice can ever fully heal. The case remains one of the most disturbing family murders in American history, a reminder that evil can emerge even in seemingly ordinary suburban families, and that the capacity for violence exists in places we least expect it.